The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
The presentation is going to last about 25 minutes. Following the presentation, we'll have a short question and answer session. If you have a question during the presentation, please type it in the chat box on the lower right of your screen. Only the moderator will see your question, and the presenter will answer as many questions as possible during the question and answer period. If we don't answer your question live, we will contact you after the webinar to give you the information you need. The webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive an email with a link to the recorded version in the email. Changing regulations and requirements make it challenging to stay current, so we've put together this webinar to clarify New York State's guidelines and to explain the techniques available for asbestos analysis. RJLG Group has pioneered the development of asbestos analysis methodologies for more than 20 years. Before 1990, some vermiculite used in building materials was found to contain asbestos, especially in spray-on fireproofing, or SOF-V. Regulated and non-regulated amphiboles meet the Environmental Protection Agency's definition of asbestos. Across the United States, many commercial buildings still contain SOF-V that could contain asbestos. The New York State Department of Health determined existing methods of analysis were insufficient to quantify low levels of asbestos, and that SOF-V containing more than 10% vermiculite must be considered asbestos-containing material, or ACM. Two methods are currently accredited for asbestos analysis in New York State: 198.8 and RJLG Group's method Lab 055.1. Our experts can now quantify both regulated and non-regulated amphiboles more accurately than ever before. I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Matthew Sanchez. Dr. Sanchez has been involved in the characterization of vermiculite and associated amphiboles for more than a decade. The research from both his master's and doctorate degrees are directly related to both the geologic and environmental issues surrounding the former vermiculite mine in Libby, Montana. He has also been involved in both method development and analysis of asbestos in air, bulk materials, soil, water, and industrial minerals. Dr. Sanchez?
All right, again, we'd like to thank you all for attending and giving us some time today as we go through some of this vermiculite work going on in New York, and as we talk specifically now about some of the analytical solutions or choices you have before you. We're going to go through a little bit of a timeline here with the New York DOH letters, the fact number 10 regarding the vermiculite. Again, the methods that have been approved to date are only for these thermal insulation systems that contain the vermiculite, these spray-on fireproofings. And again, we're going to go through and compare directly our method, this Lab 055.1, with the New York DOH 198.8 method. The start of the vermiculite concern up in New York with the DOH is they issued a letter on June 22nd, 2012 to clarify one of these their frequently asked questions they get about vermiculite. And this quote is taken directly from that guidance letter, where if vermiculite is determined to be greater than 10% in a material, that material must be reported as an asbestos-containing materials by laboratories. In some of their explanations further in that same letter, this next quote is taken from the EPA website regarding vermiculite. This information is taken directly related to vermiculite from Libby, Montana, which was mined up until about 1990, with some of the stockpiles continued to be sold for a few years thereafter. And in that vermiculite, depending on different reports that you can find and read, these concentrations go from very low quantities up to potentially up to 5% in the raw materials. So again, the assumption made here is that the vermiculite could be contaminated with asbestos coming from this Libby vermiculite mine. The amphibole asbestos from Libby is different than those that are typically dealt with in that the mineral it's an amphibole type asbestos, and the predominant type there it's called a winchite. And as by name, winchite is not a regulated mineral. Just to review, what the regulated asbestos types are, these are from the EPA, and this is what the New York DOH uses as their regulation as well. You have one that belongs into this group of minerals called the serpentine, bichrysotile. The rest of them are coming from an amphibole, the amphibole group, but this is a group of minerals with different compositions but very similar structures. But these are by name are amosite, chrysitolite, anthophyllite asbestos, tremolite asbestos, and actinolite asbestos. A few months after that initial guidance letter, another guidance letter came out to some more clarifications. The main difference in this letter is that it now allowed people that had MSDS sheets and knowledge of where this material would have come from and documentation saying the stuff was non-ACM. That would be sufficient. You wouldn't have to go back and retest and assume it was ACM if it had greater than 10% vermiculite. Our involvement in this issue, we were aware of these issues as a New York ELAB certified lab, but we really got heavily involved dealing with this vermiculite in January of 2013. Again, this was post Hurricane Sandy up there in New York and along the Jersey coast. We had a client approach us, and they were looking for a lab that could work with them and be able to take a method to the state and be able to work with the state to resolve this issue that they were facing, where they had floors that needed to be renovated from damage from the storm, and under these guidances they were dealing with this. So we've got to abate all this material kind of a situation. Our work with the state was very extensive and ongoing, and we'll describe some of the validation that we had to do in order to satisfy the state and to show what our method was capable of doing. Our validation data packages, there were many deliverables. We had deliverables, just kind of a timeline. In April of 2013, June, July, there was a big hiatus there as we waited to hear back. And then some final data was provided to New York DOH to satisfy their concerns in January. And then the final one was in February, after we had actually ran a PT sample for them, or at least a test sample as they called it, since we were the only lab that got it at that time. So again, this process has been going on for almost 2 years now. In the middle of all that, some of these validations and things that we're working on, the New York DOH, they also came out with another guidance letter. This was in July 9th, 2013, where they started to allow the use of 198.6 as long as it had this disclaimer, the specific disclaimers in front of you. This method does not remove vermiculite and may underestimate the level of asbestos present in a sample containing greater than 10% vermiculite. So again, we've made some progress here, it seemed, but you still had this kind of ambiguous, is there asbestos there, is there not, this kind of very unsatisfactory as you look at the health and safety and, the interest of your clients. The latest guidance letter on this issue came out just a few months ago on July 22nd, 2014. This is again taken directly from them. They announced the imminent availability of 2 New York State DOH ELAP approved methods for the detection and quantitation of asbestos content in these SOF-V materials. One of these methods is the RJLG group method, this Lab 0551. The other method is promulgated by the state, and it was developed in conjunction with Dr. Chatfield and with a lot of support from REPNI up there in New York, and that's been titled this 198.8. Also in that letter, they state effective, in 2 days from now, on October 31st, 2014, one of these 2 methods must be used on these SOF-V materials. Currently our lab, since July 25th, we have been accredited through New York State, their ELAP program, to run our method and be accepted in the state to analyze these vermiculite-containing fireproofings. A little furthermore on the guidance, this kind of goes into these, a little section under there in industrial applications, how these methods need to be, employed moving forward. I'm going to briefly go through these, but again, ultimately recommend you guys going and looking at these letters to understand some of these responsibilities. But all future projects with no associated surveys, you must go and sample these materials and test by one of these 2 methods. Projects with existing surveys, but no project plan, you guys need to get back in there and resample and resurvey, unfortunately. For projects with existing surveys and projects yet to be done, these are still in the phase 1A period. Must resample and resurvey. Projects in progress using an old survey with work underway, they're recommending that you go in and resample, but they're not required, and they're not requiring you to unless there's some kind of a change order on the work that's being performed. And then again, for projects that have been completed under old surveys under these informations, those are just fine as is. However, if those materials need to go get disturbed or worked on again, if those materials, a new survey is going to need to be done for those. So we're going to move on now and kind of try to contrast the two methods that are available for you guys as options. Again, so on the left here is the RJLG group, our lab method, and then the New York 198.8. And again, I'm really highlighting here the differences between the methods. Try to give you guys a better idea of what your guys' options will be. In our method, we actually dissolve the vermiculite matrix. We get rid of that vermiculite that is there. And the concept behind this is very similar to what you guys may be familiar with as the knob samples or the non-friably organic bound analyses. Our method uses both PLM and scanning electron microscopy. It's somewhat similar to TEM in that it's an electron microscopy, allows a little higher magnifications. And what it really gives us in the benefit in this analysis is it allows us to obtain some compositional data comparable to the EDS on the TEM. And what this allows us to do is allows us to differentiate these non-regulated species of amphibole asbestos from regulated amphibole asbestos types. And again, this becomes very important when you're dealing with these materials that are potentially coming from the Libby, Montana source. The composition of those amphiboles, those amphiboles are not tremolite, they are not actinolite, you know, they're these winchite-richterite series amphiboles. The New York DOH, to get the method, they utilize a density separation using some heavy liquids where they're using the different densities of the amphibole minerals with the vermiculite and other materials to be able to separate those out. I guess a crude analogy would be, you know, like panning for gold. You're looking for the heavy gold in some kind of a lighter sediment. Their method uses only PLM for the identification and quantitation of asbestos. And then this is a big difference between the two methods. As you know, using only PLM, you're not going to be able to tell apart a tremolite from a winchite based upon the optical properties. And I'll show you some more information about that here in a few more slides. Other big differences with the methods is going to be how these methods have been validated, and then, you know, the labs that are performing them, what's been required of them to be able to do the analysis. Our validation work with the New York State was very extensive. They required us to make standards of all 6 regulated types of asbestos at different concentrations, and based upon some of those results, we went back in and created more standards closer to that 1% or that ACM criteria to really test the method and see how well it performed. The validation that New York State did was performed internally. This was actually presented at an ASTM meeting this past July in Vermont, where they used one type of asbestos at different concentrations in their validation. And so, the way this works is with labs that seek the accreditation, in order to get the accreditation, they have to provide certain documentation. One of the things they need to do is provide a DOC, or a demonstration of capability, for the analysts that would perform the method. The minimum requirement for this DOC for documentation is 4 samples, and it could actually be the same sample, just analyzed, you know, 4 times. To speak more about what we did internally here, you know, working with the DOH, is, you know, we ended up having 4 separate analysts perform triplicate analyses. You know, we analyzed, we had very many data points that were collected. We also had experience up until this point with our method of analyzing, you know, several hundred commercial tests, you know, real products that were coming out of buildings at this time. Our samples were composed of 5-gram base samples, and then again we spiked in these known concentrations of the different regulated asbestos types. And again, we'll show, and what we needed to prove to the DOH is we needed to prove that our method performed as well or better than the existing methods. So we actually compared our data to both 198.1 and 198.6, with 198.6 performing much better relative to 198.1. The next slide here is just a portion of this validation data, and this is dealing with the detection of the amphibole type asbestos using our method, comparing it to the 198.6 method. So here in our vertical scale on this graph, this is the observed or the measured concentration by running the method. The horizontal scale here is the known concentration, how much we knew we put into these samples. And as you look at the concentrations, you look at how the black dots are the RJLG method, the red again here is the New York 198.6 method. The RJLG group method, our method is much tighter in its distribution of reported percentages for a known concentration. And as you start really looking importantly down here at the 0.5 and near this and the lower concentrations, these concentrations represent non-ACM materials. These are less than 1% by weight. What you find is in our method, when you start having these low levels, these 0.5s, these 0.25% amphibole levels, our method is nearly 100% accurate in our recoveries of the amphibole out of that. We're running the 198.6. In the case of the 0.5, almost all the analyses reported out as a false positive. These things would have been reported out as a positive material when in fact they were negative. Just kind of elaborate a little more on the method, what these things would look like. This picture on the left. This is a SEM image of a filter residue. So this is after our method, our preparation has been performed. Approximately 98% of these materials get dissolved in these spray-on fireproofings, and this is what you're left behind. This is a sample that was spiked with 0.1% amphibole from Libby, Montana, as an example of what these things would look like. The highlighted kind of elongate particles in red are the amphibole asbestos particles. There's many more there. Those are just shown to kind of illustrate what you should be looking at here. And then the smaller image off to the right, this is showing what the composition of that asbestos fiber is. That composition there containing these different elements that are labeled, Na represents sodium and so forth through there. That's the composition of that fiber. You can then further identify what type of amphibole that is. That kind of a composition is characteristic of material from Libby, Montana, as a windshite amphibole. This is what a positive sample there at the threshold of 1% would look like on our residues. So between these two slides, you go from there's some there to almost everything. Almost everything you see is potentially amphibole asbestos. So again, these determinations of these things, are they asbestos containing or not, becomes very apparent when you start getting high enough concentrations to get you over that ACM 1% level. A little bit further, those slides were from kind of the SEM analysis. This goes into some of the PLM analysis work. The image on the left, again, this is just a photograph of the filter. And again, the circled particle there is a bundle of amphibole asbestos that you can readily pick off. A particle's been picked off there on the right, and you can measure the optical properties and move on and try to quantitate this in regard to the residue that's remaining. And again, this is a real-world sample here. These are the kind of concentrations typically we're dealing with. Here's a similar sample, real-world sample. Again, SEM image showing the amphibole asbestos once the vermiculite and other materials have been digested away. And again, we have on the right another example of the composition of those particles. And again, we're looking at a Libby source material here, a windshite richterite. So moving on, speaking a little to 198.8. We do look forward. New York DOH, their internal lab there that performed this work for the validation. They did say in July that they will be publishing this. We look forward to seeing that, to do some further comparisons of our method to 198.8. But kind of initially, and as we've ran 198.8 in our laboratory, we've also applied for accreditation under that method as well. There's two kind of analytical problems that are associated with it on kind of the first pass through. The first, as I've already mentioned, and this is dealing with the inability of PLM to differentiate between these asbestos types, where we know are in the vermiculite that came from Libby, and what the regulated forms are. And this again is speaking to this windshite, tremolite, actinolite differentiation. The second is the potential for the amphibole asbestos to become trapped in the vermiculite float. And again, we'll elaborate both these points in the next few slides. So this slide here, this is showing, well, back up a little point. When you're doing the PLM analysis, when you go in to identify the asbestos type present, you're measuring different properties on the light microscope on the PLM. One of the most important properties that you can measure to tell whether this stuff is amosite or chrysotolite or tremolite or chrysotile is dealing with the refractive indices. For these regulated amphiboles, the refractive indices are different enough for most of them that it's readily you can readily distinguish them simply by that measurement. So what this graph is showing here is it's showing from publication by Macron on the very top line, where it's giving these different refractive indice values for tremolite. So these are kind of ranges that are observed in nature for these things. The lowest row here, it's labeled thesis index range, is taken from a thesis by Brian Banley, who back in I think it was published in 2003, where they went and did precise optical measurements of the refractive indices of material specific to the Libby vermiculite, to these amphiboles that occur in that deposit, that vermiculite deposit. I mean, really, the take-home here is if you compare these ranges that you would expect tremolite to fall within, and you'd expect these windshites from Libby to fall in, they overlap. So based on what you can measure optically, you cannot tell these two minerals apart, these two amphibole species apart. And again, this was adapted from a paper by both Millett and Banley and from 2005. To go on to the idea of potentially losing some of the amphibole in the float, according to 198.8, you actually discard the float after your heavy liquid separation. So theoretically, the separation, the amphiboles will drop out during the centrifugation, and the vermiculites will then be floating, and then it's a matter of just decanting off the vermiculite and recovering the amphiboles. So theoretically, this works well based upon the density. However, the nature of how the amphibole occurs in these materials, especially from the Libby source, is that you get the amphibole it actually forms, in place with the vermiculite, such that the amphibole asbestos can be bound between the sheets of the vermiculite. It also happens that it's potential for these amphibole fibers to be somewhat adhered or be able to kind of ride the vermiculite as it floats up, where they're not getting fully in contact with these heavy liquids and thus being able to drop out. An example of the second here, on our samples we ran for our demonstration of capability, we instead of throwing away the floats, we actually went through and looked at them on the PLM. And in fact, you can occasionally find these amphibole asbestos in the float materials. So there's a potential there of losing some of the asbestos during your preparation. I just kind of want to summarize, where we are to date. 1 year ago, we were in a situation where labs pretty much had to report out these things are ACM, or at best they could put this disclaimer. Today there are two methods that have been approved for use in the state of New York. One is our method, Labo 551. The other one is the New York DOH method, 198.8. Again, some of the highlights, what we feel is what makes our method very good, maybe very useful for you guys, is that it's able to discriminate the types of the amphiboles, and without that floating step, we're dissolving everything and putting it down. Our chance to lose material, lose the asbestos in these low levels becomes very, very minor. It reduces that potential for error. And ultimately, we worked really hard on this. We worked a lot with the New York DOH. There was very many back and forth, more data generated, looking at the data. And it is a good example of industry and regulatory body cooperation, trying to solve a problem. And this goes as well with the work done by Dr. Chatfield and Repney with their internal lab to get these options available to resolve this issue. Yeah, I think we're gonna be done right now. We'll be wrapping this up. Again, we thank you for your guys' attendance today. And again, there was the contact information I believe was left up. Please feel free to send further questions to us, and we will be happy to answer these things.
Thank you, Dr. Sanchez. Also, we just want to let you know part 2 of the webinar series will occur within the next few weeks. You'll receive an email notification to register. We'll also be posting recordings of each webinar in the series on our website for download. On behalf of Dr. Lee, Dr. Sanchez, and everyone at RJLG Group, we hope you enjoyed today's presentation.